Chapter 2: Submit to Reality, the Ideal Apprenticeship. After your formal education, you enter the most critical phase in your life, a second practical education known as the apprenticeship. Every time you change careers or acquire new skills, you re-enter this phase of life. The dangers are many. If you're not careful, you will succumb to insecurities, become embroiled in emotional issues and conflicts that will dominate your thoughts. You will develop fears and learning disabilities that you will carry with you throughout your life. Before it's too late, you must learn the lessons and follow the path established by the greatest masters, past and present, a kind of ideal apprenticeship that transcends all fields. In this process, you will master the necessary skills, discipline your mind, and transform yourself into an independent thinker, prepared for the creative challenges on the way to mastery. The first transformation. From early in his life, Charles Darwin, born 1809, died 1882, felt the presence of his father bearing down on him. The father was a successful and wealthy country doctor who had high hopes for his two sons. But Charles, the youngest, seemed to be the one who was less likely to meet his expectations. He was not good at Greek or Latin or algebra or really anything in school. It wasn't that he lacked ambition. It was just that learning about the world through books did not interest him. He loved the outdoors, hunting, scouring the countryside for rare breeds of beetles, collecting flowers and mineral specimens. He would spend hours observing the behavior of birds and taking elaborate notes on their various differences. He had an eye for such things. But these hobbies did not add up to a career. As he got older, he could sense his father's growing impatience. One day, his father rebuked him with words Charles would never forget. "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." When Charles turned 15, his father decided to become more actively involved in his life. He sent him off to a medical school in Edinburgh, but Charles could not stand the sight of blood, and so had to drop out. Determined to find some career for him, the father then secured for his son a future position in the church as a country person. For this, Charles would be well paid, and he would have plenty of spare time to pursue his mania for collecting specimens. The only requirement for such position was a degree from an eminent university, and so Charles was enrolled in Cambridge. Once again, he had to confront his disinterest in formal schooling. He tried his best. He developed an interest in botany and became good friends with an instructor, Professor Henslow. He worked as hard as he could, and to his father's relief, he managed barely to earn his Bachelor of Arts in May 1831. Hoping his schooling was forever over, Charles left on a tour of the English countryside where he could indulge all of his passions for the outdoors and forget about the future for the time being. When he returned home in late August, he was surprised to see a letter waiting for him from Professor Henslow. The professor was recommending Charles a position as an unpaid neuralist in the HMS Beagle, which was to leave in a few months on a several-year journey around the globe, serving various coastlines. As part of his job, Charles would be in the charge of collecting life and mineral specimens along the way and sending them back to England for examination. Evidently, Henslow had been impressed by the young man's remarkable skill in collecting and identifying plant specimens. This offer confused Charles. He had never thought of traveling that far, let alone pursuing a career as a naturalist. Before he really had time to consider it, his father weighed in. He was dead set against his accepting the offer. Charles had never been to the sea and would not take it too well. He was not a trained scientist and lacked the discipline. Moreover, talking several years of his voyage would jeopardize the position his father had secured him for the church. His father was so forceful and persuasive that Charles could not help but agree, and he decided to turn the offer down. But over the next few days, he thought about this voyage and what it could be like. And the more he imagined it, the more it appealed to him. Perhaps it was the lure of adventure after leading such a sheltered childhood, or the chance to explore a possible career as naturalist, seeing along the way almost every possible life form the planet could offer. Or maybe he needed to get away from his overbearing father and find his own way. Whatever the reason, he soon decided that he had changed his mind and wanted to accept the offer. Recruiting an uncle to his cause, he managed to get his father to give his very resolute consent. On the eve of the ship's departure, Charles wrote to the captain of the Beagle, Robert Fitzroy, "My second life will then commence, and it shall be as a birthday for the rest of my life." The ship set sail in December of that year, and almost instantly young Darwin regretted his decision. The boat was rather small and strongly buffeted by the waves. He was continually seasick and could not hold his food. His heart ached at the thought that he would not see his family for so long, and that he could have spent so many years cooped up with all these strangers. He developed a heart palpitation and felt like he was dangerously ill. The sailor sensed his lack of seaworthiness and eyed him strangely. Captain Fitzroy proved to be a man of wildly swinging moods, suddenly turning furious over the most seemingly trivial events. He was also a religious fanatic who believed in the literal truth of the Bible. It was Darwin's duty, Fitzroy told him, to find in South America evidence of the flood and the creation of life as described in Genesis. Darwin felt like a fool for going against his father, and a sense of loneliness was crushing. How could he endure this camped existence for months on end, living in the close quarters with a captain who seemed half insane? A few weeks into the journey, feeling somewhat desperate, he decided upon a strategy. Whether he experienced such inner turmoil at home, what always calmed him down was to head outdoors and observe the light around him. In that way, he could forget himself. That's how it was his world. This now was his world. He could observe life on the life on board this ship, the characters of the various sailors and the captain himself, as he were taking note on the markings of butterflies. For instance, he noticed that no one grumbled about the food or weather or the tasks at hand. They valued stoicism. He could try to adopt such an attitude. It seemed that Fitzroy was slightly insecure and needed constant validation about his authority in the high position within the Navy. Darwin would supply that to no end. Slowly he began to fit into the daily scheme of life. He even picked up some of the mannerisms of the sailors. All of this distracted him from his loneliness. Several months later, the Beagle arrived in Brazil, and now Darwin understood why he had wanted so badly to go on this voyage. He was completely mesmerized by the intense variety of the vegetation and wildlife. This was a naturalist's paradise. It was not like anything he had observed or collected in England. One day on a walk through the forest, he stood to the side and witnessed the most bizarre and cruel spectacle he had ever seen. A march of tiny black ants, their columns over 100 yards long, devouring every living thing in their path. Everywhere he turned, he saw something, every living thing in their path. Everywhere he turned, he saw some example of the fierce struggle for survival in the forest, which overblown life. In attending to his work, he quickly realized that he also faced a problem. All of the birds, butterflies, the crabs, and the spiders he caught were so unusual. Part of his job was to choose judiciously what to send back, but how could he be so possibly distinguish what was worth collecting? He would have to expend his knowledge. Not only would he have to spend endless hours studying everything in his sight on the walks and take copious notes, but he would have to find a way to organize all this information, catalog it all of these specimens, bring some order to his observations. It will be a Herculean task. But unlike schoolwork, it excited him. These were living creatures, not vague notes in books. As the ship headed south along the coast, Darwin realized that there were interior parts of South America that no naturalist had yet explored. Determined to see every form of life that he could possibly find, he began a series of treks into the pampas of Argentina, accompanied only by gauchos, collecting all kinds of unusual animals and insect specimens. Adopting the same strategy as on the ship, he observed the gauchos and their ways, fitting into their culture as if one of them. On these and other jaunts, he would brave mandarin Indians, poisonous insects, and jaguars lurking in the forests. Without thinking of it, he had developed a taste for adventure, as he could have shocked his family and friends. A year into the voyage, on a beach some 400 miles south of Buenos Aires, Darwin discovered something that would set his mind to thinking for many years to come. He came upon a cliff with streaks of a white amid the rock. Seeing that they were enormous bones of some sort, he began to chip away at the rock, extracting as many of these remains as possible. These were of a size and kind he had never seen before. The horns and armor of what seemed to be a giant armadillo were huge teeth of a mastodon, and then, most surprisingly, a tooth of a horse. Then the Spaniards and the Portuguese had first arrived in South America. There were no horses to be found, and yet this tooth was quite old and predated their arrival. He began to wonder if such species had died off long ago, and the idea of all life being created at once and for good seemed illogical. More important, how could so many species become extinct? Could life on the planet be in a state of constant flux and development? Months later, he was trekking through the high and looking for rare geological specimens to send back. At an evaluation about 12,000 feet, he discovered some fossilized seashells and deposits of marine rocks, a rather surprising find at such an altitude. He had examined them and the surrounding flora. He speculated that these mountains had once stood in the Atlantic Ocean. A series of volcanoes thousands of years ago must have raised them higher and higher. Instead of relics to support the stories in the Bible, he was finding evidence for something shockingly different. As the journey progressed, Darwin noted some obvious changes in himself. He used to find almost any kind of work boring, but now he could labor all hours of the day. In fact, with so much to explore and learn, he hated wasting a single minute of the voyage. He had cultivated an incredible eye for the flora and fauna of South America. He could identify local birds by their songs, the markings of their eggs, their manner of taking flight. All of this information he could catalog and organize in an efficient manner. More important, his whole way of thinking had changed. He would observe something, read it, write about it, then develop a theory, even more observation. The theories and observations feeding off one another, full of details about so many facets of the world he was exploring. Ideas were sprouting out of nowhere. In September 1835, the Beagle left the Pacific coast of South America and headed west for the journey home. Their first stop along the way was a series of virtually unoccupied islands known as the Galapagos. The islands were famous for their wildlife, but nothing could prepare Darwin for what he would find there. Captain Fitzroy gave him 1 week to explore one of the islands, and then they would be on their way. From the moment he stepped on the island, Darwin realized something was different. The small speck of land was crammed with life that was not like anywhere else. Thousands of black marine iguanas swamping around him on the beach, and in the shallow water 500-pound tortoises lumbering about at the shore. Seals, penguins, and flightless cormorantals, all cold water creatures inhabiting a tropical island. By the end of the week, he had counted 26 unique species of land birds on this island alone. His jars began to fill up with the most bizarre plant, snake, lizards, fish, and insects. Back on board the Beagle, he had begun to catalog and categorize the remarkable number of specimens he had collected. He was struck by the fact that almost all of them represented completely new species. He then made an even more remarkable discovery. The species differed from island to island, even though they were only some 50 miles apart. The tortoise shells had different markings, and the finches had developed different types of beaks, each designed for a specific kind of food on their particular island. Suddenly, as of the 4 years on this voyage, and all of his observations had distilled him, a deeper way of thinking, a radical theory, took a shape in his mind. These islands were speculated and had first been pushed up out of the water by volcanic eruptions, much like the Andes. In the beginning, there was no life found on them. Slowly, birds visited and had deposited seeds. Various animals arrived by sea, lizards or insects floating on logs. Tortoises, originally of a marine variety, swam over. Over thousands of years, each creature adapted to the food and predators that were found there, changing their shape and appearance in the process. Animals that failed to adapt died out, like the fossils out of the giant creatures Darwin had inherited in Argentina. It was a ruthless struggle for survival. Life was not created on these islands at one time and for good by some divine being. The creatures here had ever so slowly evolved to their present form, and these islands represented a microcosm of the planet itself. On the journey home, Darwin began to develop this theory further, so revolutionary in its implications. To prove this theory would now be his life's work. Finally, in October 1836, the Beagle returned to England after nearly 5 years at sea. Darwin hurried home, and when his father first saw him, he was astonished. Physically, he had changed. His head seemed larger. His whole manner was different, a seriousness on purpose and sharplessly could be read in his eyes. Almost the opposite look of the lost man who had gone to sea years before. Clearly the voyage had been transformed his son in body and spirit.
Keys to mastery. One can have no smaller or greater mastery than mastery of oneself. Leonardo da Vinci. In the stories of the greatest masters, past and present, we can inevitably detect a phase in their lives in which all of their future powers were in development, like in chrysalis of a butterfly. This part of their lives, a largely self-directed apprenticeship that lasts some 5 to 10 years, receives little attention because it does not contain stories of great achievement or discovery. Often, in their apprenticeship phase, these types are not yet much different from anyone else. Under the surface, however, their minds are transforming in ways much we cannot see, but contain all of the seeds of their future success. Much how masters navigate this phase comes from an intuitive grasp of what is most important and essential for their development. But in studying what they did right, we can learn some invaluable lessons for ourselves. In fact, a close examination of their lives reveals a pattern that transcends their various fields, indicating a kind of ideal apprenticeship for mastery. And to grasp this pattern, to follow in our own ways, we must understand something about the very idea and necessary for passing through an apprenticeship. In childhood, we are included in culture through a long period of dependency, far longer than any other animal. During this period, we learn language, writing, math, and reasoning skills, along with a few others. Much of this happens under the watchful and loving guidance of parents and teachers. As we get older, greater emphasis is placed on book learning, absorbing as much information as possible about various subjects. Such knowledge of history, science, or literature is abstract, and the process of learning largely involves passive absorption. At the end of this process, usually somewhere between the ages of 18 and 25, we are then thrust into the cold, harsh work world to fend for ourselves. When we emerge from the youthful state of dependency, we're not really ready to handle the transition to an entirely independent phase. We carry with us the habit of learning from books or teachers, which is largely unsuited for the practical, self-directed phase of life that comes next. We tend to be somewhat socially naive and unprepared for the political games people play. Still uncertain as to our identity, we think that what matters in the work world is gaining attention and making friends. And these misconceptions and naivete are brutally exposed in the light of the real world. If we adjust over time, we might eventually find our way. But if we make too many mistakes, we create endless problems for ourselves. We spend too much time entangled in emotional issues, and we never quite have enough detachment to reflect and learn from our experiences. The apprenticeship, by its very nature, must be conjugated by each individual in his or her own way. To follow precisely the lead of the others or advice from a book is self-defeating. This is the phase in life in which we finally declare our independence and establish who we are. But for this second education in our lives, so critical to our future success, there are some powerful and essential lessons that we all can benefit from, that can guide us away from common mistakes and save us valuable time. These lessons transcend all fields and historical periods because they are connected to something essential about human psychology and how the brain itself functions. They can be distilled into one overarching principle for the apprenticeship phase, and a process that loosely follows 3 steps. The principle is simple and must be engraved deeply in your mind. The goal of an apprenticeship is not money, a good position, a title, or a diploma, but rather the transformation of your mind and character. The first transformation of the way to mastery. You enter a career as an outsider. You are naive and full of misconceptions about this new world. Your head is full of dreams and fantasies about the future. Your knowledge of the world is subjective, based on emotions, insecurities, and limited experience. Slowly, you will ground yourself in reality, in the objective world represented by the knowledge and skills that make people successful in it. You will learn how to work with others and handle criticism. In the process, you will transform yourself from someone who is impatient and scattered into someone who is disciplined and focused, with a mind that can handle complexity. In the end, you will master yourself and all your weaknesses. This is a simple consequence. You must choose places of work and positions that offer the greatest possibilities of learning. Practical knowledge is the ultimate commodity and is what will pay you dividends for decades to come, far more than the paltry increase in pay you might receive at some seemingly lucrative position that offers fewer learning opportunities. This means that you move towards challenges that will toughen and improve you, where you will get the most objective feedback on your performance and progress. You do not choose apprenticeships that seem easy and comfortable. In this sense, you must see yourself as following in the footsteps of Charles Darwin. You're finally on your own, on a voyage in which you will craft your own future. It is time of youth and adventure, of exploring the new world with an open mind and spirit. In fact, whenever you must learn a new skill or alter your career path in life, you reconnect with that youthful and adventurous part of yourself. Darwin could have played it safe, collecting what is necessary and spending more time on board studying instead of actively exploring. In that case, he would not have become an illustrious scientist, but just another collector. He constantly looked for challenges, pushing himself past his comfort zone. He used danger and difficulties as a way to measure his progress. You must adopt such a spirit and see your apprenticeship as a kind of journey in which you will transform yourself rather than as a drab indication into the work world. The apprenticeship phase. The 3 steps or modes. With the principle outlined above guiding you in your choices, you must think of 3 essential steps in your apprenticeship, each one overlapping the other. These steps are deep observation, the passive mode, skills acquisition, the practice mode, and experimentation, the active mode. Keep in mind that the apprenticeship can come in many different forms. It can happen in one place over several years, or it can consist of several different positions in different places. A kind of compound apprenticeship involving many different skills. It can include a mix of graduate schools and practice experience. In all these cases, it will help you to think in terms of these steps, although you may need to give added weight to a particular one depending on the nature of your field. Step 1. Deep observation, the passive mode. When you enter a career or a new environment, you move into a world with its own rules, procedures, and social dynamics. For decades or even centuries, people have complied knowledge of how to get things done in a particular field. each generation improving on the past. In addition, every workplace has its own conventions, rules of behavior, and work standards. There are also all kinds of power relationships that exist between individuals. All of this represents a reality that transcends your individual needs and desires. And so your task upon entering this world is so observe and absorb its reality as deeply as possible. The greatest mistake you can make in the initial months of your apprenticeship is to imagine that you have to get attention, impress people, and prove yourself. These thoughts will dominate your mind and close it off from the reality around you. Any positive attention you receive is deprecative. It is not based on your skills or anything real, and it will turn against you. Instead, you will want to acknowledge the reality and submit it, muting your colors and keeping in the background as much as possible, remaining passive and giving yourself the space to observe. You will also want to drop any perceptions you might have about this world you're entering. If you impress people in these first months, it should be because of your seriousness, of your desire to learn, not because you're trying to raise up to the top before you're even ready. You will be observing two essential realities in this new world. First, you will absorb the rules, the procedures that groove in success in this environment. In other words, this is how we do things here. Some of these rules will be communed to you directly, generally the ones that are superficial and are largely matter of common sense. You must pay attention to these and observe them. But that is more internalized are the rules that are unstated, but a part of underlying work culture. These concern style and values are considered important. They're often a reflection of the character of the man or woman on top. You can observe such rules by looking at those who are on their way up in the hierarchy, who have a golden touch. More tellingly, you can observe those who are more awkward, who have been chastised for particular mistakes or even been fired. Such examples serve as negative tripwires. Do things this way and you will suffer. The second reality will observe the power relationships that exist within the group, who has real control. Though whom do all the communications flow? Who's on the right and who's on the rise and who's on the decline? For more on this element, social intelligence, please see chapter 4. These procedural and political rules may be dysfunctional or counterproductive, but your job is not to moralize about this or complain, but merely to understand them, to get a complete lay of this land. You're like an anthropologist studying an alien culture, attuned to all this nuisance and conventions. You're not there to change that culture. You will only end up being killed, or in this case of work, fired. Later, when you have attained power and mastery, you will be the one to rewrite or destroy these same rules. Every task you're given, no matter how menial, offers opportunities to absorb this world at work. No detail about the people within it is too trivial. Everything you see or hear is a sign for you to decode over time, you will begin to see and understand more of the reality that eluded you at first. For instance, a person whom you initially thought had great power ended up being someone with more bark than bite. Slowly you begin to see behind the apprentices. As you amass more information about the rules and power dynamics of your new environment, you can begin to analyze why they exist. They relate to larger trends in the field. You move from observation to analysis, honing your reasoning skills, but only after months of careful attention. We can see how Charles Darwin followed this step quite clearly. By spending the first few months of studying life on board the ship and perceiving the unwritten rules, he made his time for science much more productive. By enabling himself to fit in, he was able to avoid needless battles that would later have disrupted his scientific work. Not to mention the emotional turmoil these would have presented to him. He later practiced the same technique with Gonchos at the other local communities he came in contact with. This allowed him to extend the regions he could explore and specimens he could collect. On another level, he slowly transformed himself into perhaps the most astute observer of nature in the world has ever known, empathizing himself with any perceptions about life and its origins. Darwin trained himself to see things as they are. He did not theorize or generalize about what he had seen until he had amassed enough information, submitting and absorbing the reality of all aspects of this voyage. He ended up piercing some of the most fundamental realities of all the evolution in the living forms. Understand, there are several critical reasons you must follow this first step. First, knowing your environmental inside and out will help you in navigating and avoiding costly mistakes. You're like a hunter. Your knowledge of every detail in the forest and of the ecosystem as a whole will give you many more options for survival and success. Second, the ability to observe any unfamiliar environment will become a critical lifelong skill. You will develop the habit of stilling your ego and looking outward instead of inward. You will see in any encounter that most people miss because they're thinking of themselves. You will cultivate a keen eye for human psychology and strengthen your ability to focus. Finally, you will become accustomed to observing. First, basing your ideas and theories on what you have seen with your eyes, and then analyzing what you find. This will be a very important skill for the next creative phase in life. Step 2. Skills acquisition, the practice mode. At some point, as you progress through these initial months of observation, you will enter the most critical part of your apprenticeship. Practice towards the acquisition of skills. Every human activity, endeavor of career path involves the mastering of skills. In some fields, it is direct and obvious, like operating a tool or machine or creating something physical. In others, it is more of a mix of physical and mental, such as observing and collecting specimens. For Charles Darwin and in still others, the skills are more nebulous, such as handling people or researching and organizing information. As much as possible, you want to reduce these skills to something simple and essential, the core of what you need to get good at. Skills can be practiced. In acquiring in any kind of skill, there exists a natural learning process that coincides with the functioning of our brain. This learning process leads to what we shall call tacit knowledge, a feeling for what you are doing that is hard to put into words but easy to demonstrate in action. And to understand how this learning process operates, it is useful to look at the greatest system ever invented for the training of skills and achievements of tacit knowledge, the apprenticeship system of the Middle Ages. This system arose as a solution to a problem. As business expanded in the Middle Age, masters of various crafts could no longer depend on family members to work in the shop. They needed more hands, but it was not worth it for them to bring people who could come and go. They needed stability and time to build up skills in their workers. And so they developed the apprenticeship system, in which young people from approximately the ages of 12 to 17 would enter work in a shop, signing a contract that would commit them to a term of 7 years. At the end of this term, apprentices would have to pass a master test or produce a master work to prove their level of skill. Once passed, they were now elevated to the rank of journeyman and could travel wherever there was work, practicing the craft. Because few books or drawings existed at the time, apprentices would learn the trade by watching masters and limiting them as closely as possible. They learned through endless repetition in hands-on work, with every little verbal instruction. The word apprentice itself comes from the Latin prahendere, meaning to grasp with the hand. Because resources such as textiles, wood, and materials are expensive, as could not be wasted on practice runs, apprentices would spend most of their time working directly on materials that would be used for the final product. They had to learn how to focus deeply on their work and not make mistakes. If one added at the time that apprentices ended up working directly on materials in those years, it would amount to more than 10,000 hours, enough to establish exceptional skill level at a craft. The power of this form of tactic knowledge is embodied in the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe. Masterpieces of beauty, craftsmanship, and stability, all erected without blueprints or books. These cathedrals represented the accumulating skills of numerous craftsmen and engineers. What this means is simple. Language, oral and written, is a relatively recent invention. Well, before that time, our ancestors had to learn various skills, toolmaking, hunting, and so forth. The natural model for the learning, largely based on the power of mirror neurons, came from imitating others, then repeating the action over and over again. Our brains are highly suited for this form of learning. In an activity such as riding a bicycle, we all know that it's easier to watch someone and follow their lead than to listen or to read instructions. The more we do it, the easier it becomes. Even with the skills, they're primarily mental, such as computer programming or speaking a foreign language. It remains the case that we learn best through practice and repetition, the natural learning process. We learn a foreign language by actually speaking it as much as possible, not by reading books and absorbing theories. The more we speak and practice, the more fluent we become. Once you take this far enough, you enter a cycle of elected returns in which the practice becomes easier and more interesting, leading to the ability to practice for longer hours, which increases your skill level, which in your turn makes practice even more interesting. Reaching this cycle is the goal you must set for yourself, and to get there, you must understand some basic principles about skills themselves. First, it is essential that you begin with one skill that you can master, and that serves as a foundation for acquiring others. You must avoid at all costs the idea that you can manage learning several skills at a time. You need to develop the power of concentration and understand that trying to multitask will be the death of the process. Second, the initial stages of learning a skill invariably involve tedium. Yet rather than avoiding this inevitable tedium, you must accept and embrace it. The pain and boredom we experience in the initial stage of learning a skill toughens our minds. Much like physical exercise, too many people believe that everything must be pleasurable in life, which makes them constantly search for distractions and short circuits. The learning process, the pain, is a kind of challenge your mind presents. You will learn how to focus and move past the boredom. Or like a child, you succumb to need for the immediate pleasure and distraction? Much as with physical existence, you can get a kind of perverse pleasure out of this pain, knowing the benefits it will bring you. In any event, you must meet any boredom head on and not try to avoid or repress it. Throughout your life, you will encounter tedious situations. You must cultivate the ability to handle them with discipline. In practicing a skill, in the initial stages, something happens neurologically to the brain that is important for you to understand. When you start something new, a large number of neurons in the frontal cortex, the higher, more conscious command area of the brain, are recruited and become active, helping you in the learning process. The brain has to deal with a large amount of new information that could be stressful and overwhelming. Only a limited part of the brain were used to handle it. The frontal cortex even expands in size in the initial phase as we focused hard on the task. But once something is repeated often enough, it becomes hard written and automatic, as the neural pathways for the skill are delegated to other paths of the brain further down the cortex. Those neurons in the frontal cortex that we needed in the initial stages are now freed up to help in learning. Something else in the area goes back to its normal size. In the end, an entire network of neurons is developed to remember this single task, which accounts for the fact that we can still ride a bicycle years after we first learned how to do so. If we were to take a look at the frontal cortex of those who have mastered something through repetition, it would be remarkably still and inactive as they perform the skill. All of their brain activity occurring in areas that are lower down and require much less conscious control. The process of hardwiring cannot occur if you're constantly distracted, moving from one task to another. In such case, the neural pathways dedicated to this skill never gets established. What you learn is too tenuous to remain rooted in the brain. It is better to dedicate 2 or 3 hours in intense focus to a skill than to spend 8 hours of diffused concentration on it. You want to be as immediately present to what you're doing as possible. Once an action becomes automatic, you now have the mental space to observe yourself as you practice. You must use this distance to take note of your weaknesses or flaws that need correction, to analyze yourself. It helps also to gain as much feedback as possible from others, to have standards against which you can measure your progress so you're aware of how far you have to go. People who do not practice and learn new skills never gain a proper sense of proportion or self-criticism. They think they can achieve anything without effort and have a little contact with reality. Trying something over and over again grounds you in reality, making you deeply aware of your indicates and what you can accomplish with more work and effort. If you take this far enough, you will naturally enter a cycle of accelerated returns. As you learn and gain skills, you can begin to vary what you do, finding nuances that you can develop in the work so it becomes more interesting. As elements become more automatic in your mind, it's not exhausted. By the effort, you can practice it harder, which in turn brings greater skill and more pleasure. You can look for challenges, new areas to conquer, keeping your interest at a high level. As the cycle acclimates, you can reach a point where your mind is totally absorbed in the practice, entering a kind of flow in which everything else is blocked out. You become one thing with the tool or instrument or thing you're studying. Your skill is not something that can be put into words. It is embedded in your body and nervous system. It becomes a tactic knowledge. Learning any kind of skill deeply prepares you for mastery. The sensation of flow and for being a part of the instrument is a precursor for the great pleasures and mastery can bring. In essence, when you practice and develop your skill, any skill, you transform yourself in the process. You reveal to yourself new capabilities that were previously latent that are exposed as you progress. You develop emotionally. Your sense of pleasures become redefined. What offers immediate pleasure comes to seem like a distraction, an empty entertainment to help pass the time. Real pleasure comes from overcoming challenges, feeling confidence in your abilities, gaining fluency and skills, and experiencing the power this brings. You develop patience. Boredom no longer signals the need for distraction, but rather the need for new challenges to conquer. Although it might seem that the time necessary to master the requisite skill and attain a level of expertise would depend on a feel on your own talent level. Those who have researched the subject repeatedly come up with the number of 10,000 hours. This seems to be the amount of quality practice time that is needed for someone to reach a high level of skill, and it applies to composers, chess players, writers, and athletes, among others. This number has an almost magical or mystical resonance to it. It means that so much practice time, no matter the person on the field, leads to a qualitative change in the human brain. The mind has learned to organize and structure large amounts of information. With all of this tacit known leadage can also become creatively playful with it. Although the number of hours might seem high, it generally adds up to 7 to 10 years of sustained solid practice, roughly the period of a traditional apprenticeship. In other words, contracted practice over time cannot fail but produce results. Step 3. Experimentation, the active mode. This is the shortest part of the process, but a critical component. Nonetheless, as you gain skill and confidence, you must make the move to a more active mode of experimentation. This could mean taking on more responsibility, initiating a project of some sort, doing work that exposes you to criticisms of peers or even the public. The point of this is to gauge your process and whether there's still gaps in your knowledge. You're observing yourself in action and seeing how you respond to judgments of others. Can you take criticisms and use it constructively? With Charles Darwin, as the voyage progressed and he began to entertain the notions that would lead to his theory of evolution, he decided to expose his ideas to others. First on the Beagle, he discussed them with the captain and patiently absorbed his vehement criticisms of the idea. This, Darwin told himself, would be more or less the reflection of the public, and he would have to prepare himself for that. He also began to write letters to various scientists and scientific societies back in England. The responses he received indicated he was onto something, but that he would need some more research. For Leonardo da Vinci, as he progressed his studio work for Verrocchio, he began to experiment and to assess his own style. He found to the surprise that the master was impressed with his inventiveness. For Leonardo, this indicated that he was near the end of his apprenticeship. Most people wait too long to take this step, generally out of fear. It is always easier to learn rules and stay within your comfort zone. Often you must force yourself to imitate such actions or experiments before you think you're ready. You're testing your character, moving past your feels and developing a sense of detachment to your work, looking at it through the eyes of others. You're getting a taste for the next phase in which you produce will under constant scrutiny. You will know when your apprenticeship is over by feeling that you have nothing left to learn in this environment. It is time to declare your independence or move to another place to continue your apprenticeship and expand your skill base. Later in life, when you're confronted with a career change or you need to learn a new skill, having gone through this process before, it will become second nature. You have learned how to learn. Many people might find the notion of an apprenticeship and skill acquisition as quaint relics of bygone eras when work meant making things. After all, we have entered the information and computer age, in which technology makes it so we can do without the kinds of menial tasks that require practice and repetition. So many things have become virtual in our lives, making the craftsman model obsolete, or so argument goes. In truth, however, this idea of nature of the times we're living is completely incorrect, even dangerous. The era that we entered is not one in which technology will make everything easier, but rather time of increasing complexity that affects every field. In business, competition has become globalized and more intense. A business person must have command of a much larger picture than in the past, which means more knowledge and more skills. The future science does not lie in increased specialization, but rather in combining and cross-fertilization of knowledge in various fields. In the arts, tastes and styles are changing at an accelerated rate. An artist must be on top of this and be capable of creating new forms, always remaining ahead of the curve. This often requires having more than just specialized knowledge of the particular art form. It requires knowing other arts, even the sciences, and what is happening in the world. In all of these eras, the human brain is asked to do and handle more than ever before. We're dealing with several fields of knowledge consistently increasing with our own, and this chaos exponentially increased by the information available through technology. What this means is that all of us must process different forms of knowledge and array of skills in different fields, and have minds that are capable of organizing large amounts of information. The future belongs to those who learn more skills and combine them in creative ways. And the process of learning skills, no matter how virtual, remains the same. In the future, the great division will be between those who have trained themselves to handle these complexities and those who are overwhelmed by them, those who can acquire skills and discipline their minds, and those who are irrevocably distracted by all the media around them and can never focus enough to learn. The apprenticeship phase is more relevant and important than ever, and those who discount this notion will almost certainly be left behind. Finally, we live in a culture that is generally values intellect and reasoning with words. We tend to think of working with the hands, of building something physical, as degraded skills of those who are less intelligent. This is an extremely counterproductive cultural value. The human brain evolved an intimate conjunction with the hand. Many of our earliest survival skills depended on elaborate hand-eye coordination. To this day, a large portion of our brain is devoted to this relationship. When we work with our hands and build something, we learn how to sequence our actions and how to organize our thoughts in taking anything apart in order to fix it. We learn problem-solving skills that have wider applications, even if it's only as a side activity. You should find a way to work with your hands or to learn more about the inner workings of the machines and pieces of technology around you. Many masters in history intuited this connection. Thomas Jefferson, who himself was an avid tinker and inventor, believed that craftspeople made better citizens because they understood how things functioned and had practical common sense, all of which would serve them in handling civic needs. Albert Einstein was an avid violinist. He began that working with his hands. In this way, and playing music helped him thinking the process as well. In general, no matter your field, you must think of yourself as a builder, using actual materials and ideas. You're producing something tangible in your work, something that affects people in some direct concert way. To build anything, well, a house, a political organization, or a film, a business or a film. You must understand the building process and processes the necessary skills. You're a craftsman learning to adhere to the highest standards. For all of this, you must go through a careful apprenticeship. You cannot make anything worthwhile to this unless you have first developed and transformed yourself.